Hey everyone! Before we begin today's episode, I would like to remind you guys again to please check out some of my other YouTube channels in the description down below. I have a Star Wars Battlefront 2 Classic Focus channel where I review custom maps and mods on the Battlefront Max channel. I do gaming reviews on the Kanoa Reviews channel, and I've also recently started a Minecraft adventure channel where I play through classic adventures with friends. You can find the links in the description, and please subscribe to those channels if you like what you see. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the episode. The battle against the enemies of mankind continued. The Imperium of Man had descended onto a planet on which they believed forces and influence of chaos was present. This was indeed the case. But once they neared the ritual area, a large force was ambushed by a swarm of Tyranids. It seemed that this was a distraction that worked in the opportunity of the forces of chaos. Instead of ordering an exterminatus, which was most common with Tyranid infestation, that is, if the Inquisitor came to the conclusion that a planet could no longer be salvaged, the order was given to stand their ground and fight back against these creatures. The initial force was completely wiped out, and thus, the help of the Ultramarines was requested. A drop zone had already been established. An Imperial Guard had made a makeshift defensive perimeter as more Tyranids could be spotted at the horizon. The swarm that they would face seemed smaller in size compared to the one during the contact fight. But nevertheless, this particular swarm had some more powerful creatures amongst their ranks, making many an Imperial Guard nervous. They did have a handful of Leman Russ tanks though, which they used as static turret defenses which could easily shoot over everyone from a good overwatch point. But the Tyranids had the makeshift point surrounded, and thus they would be coming from almost everywhere, likely overwhelming them in a matter of minutes. The Ultramarines would make their descent any moment, but there were those who were doubting even that would be long enough to where they could hold out. Some of the Tyranids amongst their forces were taller than a Space Marine, with razor-sharp claws that could easily cut through a whole squad with a single slash. They were built for killing, the ultimate predator. The sounds they made and the screeching filled many soldiers' heart with fear. And when all the Tyranids were in position and had them surrounded, the attack commenced. The ground began to tremble as they leaped forward and started to head towards the makeshift defensive point. The weaker and smaller units were ahead of the swarm, as they would take on most of the punishment and be used as sacrifices so that the bigger units could get close enough to make the kill. The commissars and officers told everyone to get ready. Death was approaching, but they would stare right back at it. Those in the trenches did not have that good an overview as the ones above, or the tanks. Plasma was launched from the turrets, and the field lit up like a bloody fireworks show. It did not take long for the infantry to notice more Tyranids coming from different directions from the corner of their eyes. Commissars pointed out targets for those who failed to find one amidst the chaos. Despite the battle looking hectic, some of the soldiers were calm. No blood had been spilled yet on their side. Their aim was steady, their faith in their emperor stern. The smaller critters of the Tyranids did indeed suffer the entire wrath of the Imperial Guards, as hundreds were slaughtered on the mere approach. In a way, it was to the Imperium's advantage that none of these enemy units were long-distance fighters. But by being surrounded, there were always a handful of Tyranids that slipped through all the fire coming their way. They had still not reached the trench line, but they were moving closer and closer with each breath one took. And then the moment was there, where the first victim would fall in the Imperial Guard unit. He was cleaved halfway down the middle, blood engulfing those standing next to him, and more would follow soon. The units at the rear tried their best to kill any of the Tyranids at the flank, but chaos had now broken out around their perimeter, issuing some to run or abandon their post. They did not get very far though. Some of the warrior Tyranids had reached the trench as well, towering over all units and biting, stomping, and clawing their way through a bloody mess. In a sense, those stuck in the trenches were cornered. Putting their head over the edge would be fatal, and climbing over the sandbags to a higher position would take too long and expose one to the point where they would undoubtedly be killed. To give the units in and around the trenches some room to breathe, another airstrike was called in to deal with some of the Tyranids that came through on the fields behind them. The hellfire of the explosions made the chaos complete, as the infantrymen held on for dear life as they were knee-deep in the blood of their fellow battle-brothers. Screams of pain and death were muffled by the thunderous explosions. The ones who felt most at ease were the ones in the Leman Russ tanks that continued to punish each and every Tyranid that dared to come too close. Many of the smaller Tyranids had already been dealt with, but now the main warrior types were closing in fast, being able to take a lot more punishment and being more deadly overall. Though the soldiers who were stationed in the trenches, against the sandbags and around the tanks were safe from the artillery fire, the ones in the field at the rear ran too far in their panic as they were trying to deal with the Tyranids. Many of them got hit by the artillery, splattering apart in 1,000 pieces. The rain of airstrikes continued, and those calling it in gave new coordinates that came closer and closer to the actual defensive perimeter. It would become danger close, but the bigger Tyranid creatures were easier to hit as they were so large. But they were strong as steel. Most infantry could only shoot off a few limbs, making the Tyranids still lethal as ever. And there were some who let fear take hold of them and could not even fire off a single shot once they laid eyes upon one. For those, it did not end well. Most of the front of the trench line had broken. Bodies of both Imperial Guard and Tyranid laid sprawled out or in pieces amongst the ruins. By now, some could in fact retreat back up behind the sandbags to give themselves a bit more cover. Ironically, the Tyranid bodies were so en masse that those that were still approaching the trench line were slowed down as they had to step over multiple corpses of their own kind. The Leman Russ tanks, however, could still cut through the larger Tyranids like a knife through butter. Many sought cover behind them as they felt somewhat safe. But the issue now was that the direction of the airstrikes had moved in such a way with the Imperial Guard who were right under it. Commissars shouted everyone to dig in and keep small while still firing at the Tyranid filth. In some ways the battle had died down a bit. In the distance no more Tyranids could be seen approaching, and all the fighting that was happening was in the direct vicinity of the trench line. But the remaining Imperial Guard were not that many, and there was still the danger lurking of being overrun. Many wondered when the hell the Ultramarines would show up. But then the Imperial Guard units took their worst hit yet. Since the artillery was so danger close, it had every chance to hit right on top of the soldiers. And so it did. The Leman Russ on the right got struck by a blinding explosion, sending sand and dust flying everywhere. The explosion made the ears ring of anyone standing near it. It was such a devastating blow that it was never clear how many soldiers were lost that were standing around the tank for cover. What was known though was that despite the Leman Russ tank taking damage, the crew inside were still unscathed, if a little shaken up, and continued to fire against their enemies. Many of the soldiers around the sandbags were covered in sand, many having to hold fire to rub it out of their eyes. But the amount of screeches that could be heard had diminished. Despite the artillery claiming the lives of multiple Imperial Guards, it did also have the same direct effect on the Tyranids by a multitude. The battle was coming to a close. Only the final of the Tyranids were left. But despite facing less than 100 on the field, the amount of Imperial Guard that was still standing had decreased significantly. Many had given up hope. But then someone pointed towards the skies, and indeed, the Ultramarines had arrived. Their drop pods squashed the Tyranids beneath them to pulp, and with the help of the Marines, the battle was won in the end. For the next several hours, more and more drop pods were coming down to the surface. The Ultramarine commander wanted a word with whoever was in charge on the perimeter. All of the officers and commissars had been killed, so it was left to the highest ranking infantryman that was still alive. The commander informed everyone to head back to the nearest Imperial base to patch themselves up. More battles with the Tyranids would come in the future, but for now, they were the concerns of the Ultramarines. whirlwinds and predators would be dropped soon, as would dreadnoughts. But this would take time, and at the horizon a new wave of Tyranids made themselves be known. That is the thing with Tyranids, there are always more. That is why it's so common to respond with an exterminatus. The commander called his loyal ultramarines to his side, and told them to rebuild a defensive perimeter with this time whirlwinds behind them. Imperial guards that could still stand or had suffered minor wounds were given a choice to stand back on the hill and watch as the holy ultramarines would purge this land from the xenofilth. It was a display not many Imperial guard got to witness.